Recording in progress.
Good morning, honorable members. I trust you are well. Welcome to this particular meeting. I'd like to start promptly on time with all the honorable members who are here. Just for the purpose so that you know you are in the right place, this is the Standing Committee on Appropriations, and we'll be certainly looking at a briefing by National Treasury today. So with that in mind, I want to ask for just the processing of any apologies, and then we'll adopt the agenda and then get on with the business of today. So let me just quickly, I have noted the one, obviously today we have an apology from Honorable Hlonyane, who is still not well. And then I think the second one is Honorable Lekhanyane is obviously at the Commonwealth Conference in Australia. He's suffering there, so he will be out. He sent his apology. And then I acknowledge the apology by the Deputy Minister of Finance, Dr. David Masondo, who will be leaving the meeting at 10 a.m. for a meeting with the PIC straight after that. And so those are the apologies I note. Are there any other ones that we've received today? Maybe the Secretariat, Darren or Mashile, maybe you can update.
Good morning, Chair, honorable members and colleagues. No, from our side, that's the only apologies that we have received. If there are others, then we will let the Chair know before the end of the session.
Fantastic. With that in mind, let me have a quick look. On the agenda today, we're looking at a presentation by National Treasury, and then we'll go straight to questions and deliberation with members. There are no other additional items that will be going onto this agenda. Can I then ask for a mover of the agenda, noting the apologies that have been tabled? If I can request, if members want to make inputs, if I can ask for members then to be able to switch on their cameras. I know people like to say that they're in rural areas. I was with Vodacom last week. There was a strong suggestion that their network coverage seems to have gone countrywide, and the other providers are there. So if I can ask members if you can switch your camera on so that we know when you speak, and then you can make your input. Is there a mover for the agenda?
I move, Honorable Chairperson.
Thank you, Honorable Bartlett. I appreciate it. And if the network is holding in the Northern Cape, it should hold for the rest of the country.
Then you must bring the wind.
May I ask for a second of the agenda?
Chair, you've made your Venn diagram too small. So I'm happy to second.
I appreciate it, Honorable Beck. We will move from there. I would have presumed you are in the Republic of George.
Cape Town.
Cape Town. In the light of that, honorable members, with the agenda being adopted, I think given the schedule that we've got, we've had a very busy while looking at obviously the tabling of the MTBPS last week, the meeting we had with Finance and Treasury. We also had the briefing yesterday with PBO and FFC. I make those remarks so that the team at Treasury is fully well aware that there's been a lot of discussion on this issue, and having looked at both presentations, I want to urge the team to keep in mind that we circulate documents so that members can read, and we want to allocate members enough time today to make deliberations and inputs. So it's in that spirit that we want to proceed with the presentations. Before we get going, I want to ask the Deputy Minister of Finance, Honorable Masondo, to welcome the team, make some remarks, and then obviously and naturally be able to then hand over to the team to take us through the presentation. Welcome also Deputy Minister Esho Saropin. Great to have you with us, and I'm certainly looking forward to our engagement today. Let me allow for Honorable Masondo to make his remarks.
Honorable Chair of the Standing Committee on Appropriations, Honorable Musima Imani, and honorable members of the Committee of the Appropriation Committee, and my fellow Deputy Minister Finance, Honorable Sarupin, and everyone on the platform, including the National Treasury team. Good morning. So the minister last week made proposals on the adjustment of the main budget that he presented in February towards the end of the 6th administration. He basically made proposal on the adjustment of that budget, and we usually do this due to unforeseen, unavoidable expenditure as required by the law. And obviously, when we make any adjustment on the budget, it has consequences on the fiscal framework, on the division of revenue. We're basically making an amendment on the act passed by Parliament, because once the budget is adopted by Parliament, becomes law, and if there's any adjustment, those adjustments have to be obviously approved by Parliament, which is the only body which has legislative powers to make laws in this country. So the adjustments have been made, and there are consequences insofar as the fiscal framework is concerned. and the Division of Revenue. And like you said, Chair, we presented this last week on what has been the implications on the fiscal framework and the Division of Revenue. And I take it that in that context, this committee, without restricting itself on a few things, but it will largely focus on the Division of Revenue Amendment Bill, the Adjustment Appropriation Bill, the Special Appropriation Bill, and any other matter that it deems necessary. And in order to facilitate such a conversation, the National Treasury team is here, and we will follow your advice that we should not speak as if it's for the first time that we are presenting these issues here, in order to save time and allow more time for the committee members to provide guidance, insight, critique, feedback on what we have presented. And like I said, it is unfortunate that I'll have to leave at 10, and thanks for highlighting my apology, Chair, that I'll have to leave at 10 o'clock, but the team, together with Deputy Minister Sarupin, will remain to have a conversation with the committee and get guidance from the committee, so that at the end of the day, we should make sure that if there's been any blind spots from our side as the National Executive Committee of Government, we will get guidance and critique and feedback from the legislative arm of the state. Maybe at this stage, let me hand over to the National Treasury team to take us through. And Chair, if there are questions that we did not adequately answer in the last session in which all committees of finance were present, because I do think that we try to answer all the questions, but if there's any outstanding question we've not answered, we will ask the committee to highlight that. And if in this meeting we are not able to answer some of these questions, we'll definitely come back to you either in writing so that those questions are answered, because we have a responsibility as the executive of government to sufficiently and honestly answer any question that would emerge from yourself. So if there's any question that we've not adequately answered from the last meeting, we're more than willing to answer. But if we're not able to do so in this meeting, we should be able to give you those answers in writing. Let me hand over to the National Treasury team. And thank you very much, Chair. Rendani, I take it that you are leading, or is DG. Over to you.
Good morning, honorable members, and good morning to Deputy Ministers of Finance, colleagues. My name is Rendan Randela. I'm from the National Treasury Public Finance Division. We're gonna have two presentations, Chair. One will be on the Adjusted Appropriation Bill and the Special Appropriation Bill, and the other one, it will be on the Division of Revenue Amendment Bill. I will start with the ones with the presentation on the Appropriation Bill, the two of them, Adjusted Appropriation Bill. I will try to project it. Can you all see the presentation? May I get an indication?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay. Let me proceed, Chair. Yes, Chair. Last week we had a workshop on this, but we were using dummy numbers. We didn't want to steal the thunder of our minister. Today we'll be using the real numbers as tabled. And hopefully this is going to be much simpler to follow than last week. This is the presentation outline. Let me not go through it because I'm still going to touch on all of those. Some of this will be a repetition of what we had last week. By way of introduction, this process in the main of the adjustment budget is guided by Section 30 of the PFMA, and there are 7 aspects that that guides it. That's in terms of Section 32. I'm still going to touch on all of those because the adjustments that are being presented were guided by this section. The first one being unforeseeable, significant and unforeseeable economic and financial events, unforeseeable and unavoidable expenditure, Section 16, shifting of funds, defilements and rollovers. So this is in terms of the documents which were tabled. Let me not dwell much on this. Let me move to this. This is the process as I think by now the committee knows this. Like I said last week, the process is pretty much the same as the appropriation bill process, where we start with the fiscal framework. After that, it's division of revenue amendment. And after that, it's going to be the appropriation bill. So now coming to the tabling of the MTBPS and the summary of the adjustments. This flows from Section 12 of the Money Bill and Related Matters Act of 2009. So I won't dwell much on this slide because this slide will also be covered by the next slide. And these are the documents that gets tabled on the day. Normally is the speech itself, adjusted appropriation bill, special appropriation bill, and the division of revenue amendment bill. This in the main is what brings us here. I've also highlighted Chapter 5 of the MTBPS publication, especially that for the first time we've got a chapter on public sector infrastructure. All this is in compliance with Section 12 of the Money Bill Amendment Procedure and Related Matters Act. That requires us to cover those aspects in the previous slide, like the fiscal framework, the spending priorities over the medium term, etc. Like Chapter 4 deals with expenditure priorities, Chapter 3 fiscal policy, and then Chapter 2 is economic outlook. So, Chair, last week we're using dummy numbers in respect of unforeseeable and unavoidable expenditure. So these are the real numbers in the adjusted appropriation bill. Starting with the unforeseeable and unavoidable expenditure, I'm not gonna go in details through each one of them. The total is 2.1 billion. Almost 95, 96, 97% of this expenditure, it's expenditure to deal with infrastructure damaged by floods in various municipalities and provinces. 683, it's allocated now to proposed allocation. Oh, sorry, Chair, I've lost the presentation from my side. I don't know what I did. Is it still visible on your side?
I can still see it from my
Okay,
end.
yes, yes, it's back. It's back. So for the floods, I think almost 1.6 billion is for the floods, of which 683 flows to municipalities via the Department of Cooperative Governance. The big amount, some of them were worth mentioning there, is 426 million to replenish the emergency housing grant. That's through the vote human settlement. Other small allocations around 30 million or so, they are to cater for the new ministries, especially the deputy minister's position. That's with regard to unforeseeable and avoidable expenditure. The total in there is 2.1 billion. Moving to the next category, we've got the use of funds in emergency situation in terms of Section 16 of the PFMA. So in there, we've got 2.1 billion allocated to the South African National Defence Force. for the operation in the DRC. This is one of those which were mentioned in the budget speech. I'm still going to also present on other expenditures which were mentioned as part of the budget tabled in February. So appropriation of expenditure announced during the tabling of the 24 budget for future allocations. So in the main, in the speech, we had G20, which was also mentioned in the budget. We also have the COVID, the increase of the grant from 350 to 370, as well as deployment of the SNDF members in Mozambique and DRC. In total, we have got 2.6 billion of the appropriation of expenditure announced during the tabling of the 2024 budget. The next category that we have as part of the adjustment is shifting of funds between votes. When we had our first meeting, when we presented Q1 expenditure report, there was also the question around some measures that we do in year, or that some measures that we take in year to adjust the budget. One of which, there are obvious cases where we foresee a department underspending and other departments struggling. So in this case, just to give an example, the figures in brackets, it's money taken away from that particular vote, and the positive number is the receiving department. So if I can just use an example of higher education, 272 was taken away, and that allocation went to DERCO to deal with its foreign exchange losses. And the 272 is the net, because there's also money coming into higher education to cater for the new ministers from science and technology. So, but the figure itself is 300 million on higher education because of the delays with the delivery of infrastructure projects. If I can move on to the second one, military veterans, money taken away from that department, 51 million to the Office of the Chief Justice to cater for its budget shortfalls. So I'm just highlighting a few. In agriculture, this is a legacy problem when the Department of Forestry and Fisheries was still one, but when it was migrated to be a standalone department, there was part of the allocation for compensation of employees. So let me move to the next category. Rollover in total, I think is 2 billion. I think that total is reflected in the next slide. This is mainly for those expenditure that couldn't that was committed from the previous financial year, but the transaction didn't really happen. It provides for so many reasons, starting with the presidency. The biggest one in there, it's social development, payment of the outstanding or accrued COVID-19 social relief of distress 350 grants. If I can move to the next slide, we've got defense in there, accommodation charges, as well as the rates and taxes of the Department of Public Works. So in total, Honorable Chair, we have got 2 billion for the funds rollover to the current financial year. The rollovers is guided by section by Treasury Regulation 6.4. Like I think I went through this in detail last week. And then we've got self-financing expenditure. I explained the concept last week using dummy numbers. So this time around, I'm using the real numbers. And the biggest then, it's Home Affairs, is expenditure incurred in issuing official document, which is defrayed by revenue generated from issuing the documents. So in short, Chair, you have got departments with activities that generate revenue, and that revenue gets deposited into the National Revenue Fund. And for that revenue to go back to the department, it must be appropriated specifically to go back to the very same activity to generate further revenue. So in this case, if I can just give an example with Home Affairs, they generate revenue from the official documents like passport, IDs, and that revenue goes back to the department for the production of those documents. Same with GCIS. The principle is the same. They've got a newspaper, Vukuzenzele. They generate revenue from the adverts, and then that money flowed back towards the production of the very same newspaper. So the list goes on and on, also with other departments in terms of the revenue that they generate from the various activities, and then the money gets plowed back. In total, it's 2.5 billion of self-financing expenditure. So we also have small pockets of declared unspent funds and projected underspending, small business development, unspent funds declared on compensation for employees, mainly as a result of vacancies, 17 million, water and sanitation, 225 million. This is mainly due to the revised implementation plan and the cash flow projections for the sanitation infrastructure upgrade project funded by the BFI. So the commitment to deliver on the project is still there. The main reason for this declared unspent fund is as a result of the revision of the implementation plans. So, Chair, the special appropriation bill was also tabled last week. It's a total of 5.1 billion to 4 departments. Let me start with the first department, which is transport, 5 billion rand. So the 5 billion is for the e-tolls, the GFEP. That's the money that gets paid to SANRAL. So that allocation is in 2 parts. 70% of the commitment is carried by the national government, and 30% of the SANRAL debt for GFEP is carried by the Gauteng province. So in the current financial year, 5 billion is due for payment. Of that 5 billion, 3.8 billion is by the province, Gauteng, and 1.2 billion is by the national government. Why the difference? Of the 3.8 billion, we've got 546 million for maintenance by Gauteng. There's a memorandum of agreement signed between Gauteng and the national, with Gauteng having opted to pay the debt within 5 years, and then the national, I think, over 12 years. So the repayment of this, it's guided by the debt maturity profile of this of the debt itself. So hence the difference with regard to these repayments. On average, I think Gauteng over the next 4 years, it will be around 3.3 or 3.2 billion or so, and then it will be done. And meaning that for the first 5 years, the weight will be more on Gauteng, and then going forward, it will be for the national. So secondly, we have got an allocation that goes to presidency, justice and constitutional development, and the international relations and cooperation. In total, it's 95.6 million for legal proceedings against Israel in the International Court of Justice. So this is what we have in the special appropriation bill. That in total is 5.1 billion. So, Chair, this slide shows a summary of environments per vote and economic classification. So it's a very busy slide, but don't worry much about it, because I need to highlight that the details of these is included in the adjusted AE&E publication. Each vote, it's outlined there in all the allocations, including these shifts. They are outlined in that particular publication. So just in summary, if we look at the last row there, the grand total, we'll see that in total 7 billion has been shifted around. On the left-hand side is the from. On the right-hand side, it's where the money is going in terms of economic classification. So if we look at the first column, which is the COE, we've got 3 billion taken away. And then if we look on the two side, on the COE, we find that we've got 576 million that went into COE, meaning that the biggest recipient of this shift, if we look at, for example, capital transfers, 753 taken away, and then we have got 1.2, meaning that capital is the recipient of this shift. So in the explanatory memorandum or note in the form of the AENE publication, we've got a big book that includes all the votes in one, and the small publication, which is single votes. In their Chair, you will see for each environment table, there is a superscript 1 and 2, denoting those environments approved by the National Treasury and those environments that are for the attention of Parliament. And last year, when I presented those environments. What are those environments that are for parliamentary attention? For example, if environments exceed 8% of the program allocation, that's for Parliament. Exclusively appropriated is for Parliament. And then we've got those other environments guided by Section 43 of the PFMA, Section 6, Treasury Regulation 6.3, and Section 5 of the Appropriation Act, guiding these environments and shifts. So that's in short, Chair, this concludes my presentation, and thanks very much. And through you, Chair, I will now hand over to my colleague, Okhale, and the team to present on the division amendment, Division of Revenue Amendment Bill. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair and honorable members and DMs and colleagues. Let's please share the presentation. So Chair will also try to be brief as well. So I must indicate that it will be so our presentation it will be done by myself, Okhale Letseng Kharekwe, followed by Dr. Letseba Pakis and Wendy. So, but will really be brief in our presentation. Next slide. So in terms of the outline, is similar to what I had presented last week at the workshop. I will cover the overview, which will also indicate changes to the schedules, changes to provincial allocations, as well as changes to local government allocations, and changes to gazetted conditional grants frameworks and allocations. And we'll touch briefly on the 2025 Division of Revenue, and also on the framework for funding for disasters. So next slide. I will not, I've already spoken to it last week, but just to say that as Dr. Randela was highlighting what Section 32 covers, so for this presentation, essentially provinces and municipalities are benefiting from unforeseeable and unavoidable expenditure, which is in the for funding for disasters in this regard. And as well as there'll be some shifting of funds that affects one conditional grant, and as well as there'll be a rollover of unspent funds of an indirect grant, the school infrastructure backlogs grant. Next slide. So essentially here, this is the changes in the schedules, and this is Schedule 1, which indicates funding for each sphere of government, in particular the equitable shares of each sphere of government. So what has happened is that, as members can see, with the column, the red column, column A, we're adjusting column A because it's for the 2024-25 financial year. So, and if you look at the table below, essentially here we're adjusting mainly the national share. So provinces and local government equitable shares are not being adjusted, but they're benefiting from that funding through conditional grants. So I'll hand over to Letsepa for the next slides. Please be brief, Letsepa.
Thanks, Didichi, and good.
The
good morning
presentation is
to-
not on the screen yet. You've taken it out.
Oh, okay. Now let me do that now. I hope you can see it now, honorable members. It's sharing on my side, and I hope you can see me. So my slide, honorable members, are going to touch on both the provincial as well as the local government allocations emanating from the amendment bill. So quite importantly, I think it's building from Dr. Rendani Randele's presentation around the response to disasters. So there is an additional allocation of 948 million, which is going to be flowing through various provincial conditional grants. And this is really to assist the Western Cape province in terms of dealing with the disasters that occurred between December 2023 and July 2024, in terms of rehabilitating the infrastructure there. And these grants are the Comprehensive Agriculture Support Program, which is allocated 300 million. There are also some additions that are made to other conditional grants, including the Provincial Roads Maintenance Grant to the amount of 571 million. So these were assessed by the Disaster Management Center, and the recommendation was then made to the National Treasury Committee, which then recommended these amounts. It is important to note, honorable members, at this point that there are also some disasters that are still under consideration in terms of funding, where applications are being verified and being made, and then the Disaster Management Center, once that process is concluded, would then make the necessary recommendations to the Treasury, and these would then be allocated funding as and when that information becomes available. 251 million has also been added from the BFI, the Budget Facility for Infrastructure, for the Western Cape Rapid School Build Program. So this is funding that was indicated in the main budget, but there were conditions that were put for the province and the department to then adhere to. So those have been met, and then the funding is being released for implementation at this point. Again, honorable members, there is also a rollover of fund that has been made for the school infrastructure backlogs grant, and this is to ensure that the projects related to the school sanitation program initiative are being catered for. If I can quickly move to the local government allocations, again, honorable members, this is to also respond to the municipal disaster that occurred between December 2023 as well as July. Assessments have been made, and there are about 5 provinces whose allocations have been approved for this round of allocations. Quite important to note that within these provinces, a number of municipalities that were impacted have been provided with additional funds to then be able to address the issues of disaster recovery. An emerging issue here, honorable members, is of course the delays and the failures in terms of spending these funds. This particular round was quite difficult because amongst these provinces, also the municipalities within them have experienced severe disasters before, especially floods, and funding has been provided to these municipalities. However, the spending on the ground has really been lacking, which has really led to some tough decisions having to be taken around the additional resources that get to then be made in light of the capacity issues that have been shown. But the Disaster Management Center is working quite closely with municipalities to ensure that they are able to spend the funds that have been allocated. There's a 310 million that has been shifted from one of the conditional grants to local government, which is the Public Transport Network grant. This is also linked to the formalization of the taxi industry, which is where these funds have been allocated towards, which is an important initiative within the department because it's starting to align the funding with where actually or the preferred sector and mode of transport that the commuters are preferring. So this 300 million was made available from the municipalities that are struggling to spend the funding, which in any case would have led to underspending at the end of the financial year. Dr. Randele has spoken to this. So from the BFI funding, the Drakenstein municipality was allocated funding previously, but they wrote to the Treasury to indicate that due to some capacity issues, they would like to defer the implementation of certain parts of the projects to the next financial years. And as a result, they declared a saving of about 225 million. From there, those funding will then be added in the future allocations towards the municipality to ensure that the project in its totality is still going to be implemented as planned. There is also a rollover, honorable members, of 29 million from an indirect grant, which is the Municipal Systems Improvement Grant. This is also to ensure that projects related to the smart cities as well as the data management are also completed. Honorable members, by law, we are required to then consult with yourselves when there are any changes that affect the conditional grants framework. This is according to section 15.4 of the Division of Revenue Act. So the following frameworks are going to be amended pending your approval of them. So we request that you consider approving that we amended the framework related to the Municipal Disaster Recovery Grant. Here is also just to ensure that the funds that have been added to those municipalities from the 5 provinces are actually ring-fenced for the purposes of the reconstruction and rehabilitation. So we will just be specifically showing that in the grant framework so that those funds cannot be used for any other purposes. The same we will then do, honorable members, in terms of the other provincial grants to also ensure that we earmark the 948 million, which is for the recovery of the provincial infrastructure. The same will then be done in terms of the allocation from the BFI pot for the Western Cape Rapid School Building Program. And then we also want to ask the honorable members to also consider approving that in the frameworks, we also are in a position to then add the amounts that are being rolled over, because those would also have an impact in terms of the funds that are available for the 24-25 baseline for those respective grants, which are the school backlogs grant, the public transport network where funds are moving away from, as well as the regional park infrastructure grant where Drakenstein's allocation changes are going to be impacted. So once the honorable members have approved these and then the bill has been enacted, then as the Treasury, we are then going to gazette these frameworks as part of the bill. I'm gonna end here, then honorable members and assist Wendy with flighting going forward. Thanks.
Good morning, honorable members. And what Dr. Pakis and Ugali presented was what is contained in the 2022 Division of Revenue Amendment Bill. which contains the changes to the actual act in 2024. What I'll be touching on is what has been announced as part of the medium-term budget policy statement and what is intended for implementation in the 2025 MTF. These processes are not yet concluded, so work is still ongoing, and further cabinet decisions in this regard is still required. We all know that we're in a fiscally constrained environment, and but there are also priorities to be funded. Those issues still need to be addressed, and that will be presented when we come to Parliament in February. What is currently indicated is the preliminary 2025 division of revenue that shows the split between national government, provincial government, and local government. As you can see, in terms of provinces and local government, the largest contributions from the national fiscus is through the equitable share, and conditional grants also make quite a big portion. And then for local government, there's also the general sharing of the fuel levy. And if you can look at the column right at the bottom, and specifically focus on 2024-25, that is the current year that we're in, national government share is 49%, provinces share is 41.3%, and local government share is 9.6%. And then if you look at over the 2025 MTF, you could see that national share is declining to 47.7%. Provinces are increasing to 42.6%, and local government shares increasing. It goes up to 9.8 the previous year, and then it declines slightly to 9.7 in the outer year of the MTF. What is presented here is already what has been approved for the 2025 MTF, and it contains reallocations, and it's listed there. Some funds are reprioritized from the Provincial Roads Maintenance Grant to fund critical and important priorities in the transport sector. And then the indirect grant, which is given to Eskom. Some funds are shifted to assist the National Department to complete the National Electrification Master Plan. And of course, the two talks to each other, because what programs are funded in Eskom and municipalities are informed by the National Electrification Master Plan. And then the same in the Public Transport Network Grant. It is also to fund critical priorities in the transport sector. Maybe to indicate what is still outstanding, and it's quite critical. What Dr. Pakkies presented is the in-year funding for disasters. But what is not covered is that there's still many more applications, and I'll touch on it a bit more detail in coming slides. But what is not listed here is some of the funding that did not qualify for or did not fall within the criteria of the unforeseen and unavoidable. And I will indicate in later slides how that is funded. Some critical important priorities that still is in provinces and municipalities. And we can give one example is the ECD, where the subsidy level needs to be reviewed, and also the number of beneficiaries need to be reviewed. And we will need to determine how we can secure funding for that. And another one is also the budget facility for infrastructure, where certain projects have been approved, but funding for that still needs to be secured. And we're exploring innovative ways of securing that funding because it is related to infrastructure. Dr. Pakkies, can you go to the next slide? Because what the next slide shows are those projects that's already been approved, and you can see there are multiple provinces and municipalities that will benefit through this program. And maybe what is very important to indicate here, it's only projects that's of big value, and also projects that comply with set standards for infrastructure delivery, and it must also be shovel ready. So many applications are received, but only those that meet the required requirements are then considered for funding. Thank you. Next slide. We've indicated that we're busy with a review of the conditional grant system. So we reviewed all conditional grants in the system due to concerns that's been raised. One of the concerns raised was that there are just too many conditional grants in the system. So the changes will be implemented over multiple years. And the first changes emanating from this reform will be implemented in the 2025 MTF. So to streamline the conditional grants, there are a number of mergers of conditional grants where there are conditional grants that's got similar purposes but are two separate grants. And what that means, there are different people in national government that need to administer the grant. In provinces and municipalities, there are various people that must also implement grants with different conditions. So the paperwork and the administration and the benefits of having those separated are questionable. So what is being proposed is the merger of the Comprehensive Agriculture Support Grant together with the Ilima Letsema grant. National Treasury is currently in consultations with the department responsible for those grants to do it in such a manner that we ensure that current projects are not discontinued or hampered because of this consolidation. So most probably what will be done, the grant will be phased in over the MTF where the two will be merged. And the conditional grant frameworks will be amended to ensure that both the programs are still contained in the one conditional grant framework. In the education space, we've got what we call a direct grant. A direct grant is where the money goes directly from the national department to a province or municipality. An indirect grant is where a national department performs a provincial or municipal function on behalf of the province or the municipality. So the national spends the money on behalf of the province or municipality. In the education space, there's two infrastructure grants. The one is direct and the other one is indirect. And the idea is to merge the two and make it a direct grant to provinces. And then there's also two provincial EPWP grants, and these are also merged, but both objectives will still be contained in the one merged conditional grant. Then there's also a proposal to merge one of the conditional grants into the provincial equitable share, and that is the Community Library Services Grant. The reason for this request is initially there were not enough community libraries, so the focus was on infrastructure. Now the community libraries have been built and the focus has shifted largely to maintenance. So the provincial equitable share is the appropriate tool because that is where maintenance is addressed. And then some of the indirect allocations that's currently in two departments, one in the Department of Cooperative Governance, the other one in National Treasury. That's when National performs national support functions that benefit municipalities. And the appropriate place to put that is not in a conditional grant, but on the National Department's baseline. So those grants will then not become grants anymore and will be directly on the baseline of the National Department concerned. Next slide. Okay, as I indicated, I'll come back to this. There's the legislative framework for funding disasters are both contained in the Disaster Management Act and the Division of Revenue Act. And there are various sources of funding. The first response should be for provinces and municipalities to direct their own sources to address disasters. We all know that we get disasters of different magnitude. We get relatively small disasters that they do damage, but they don't impact the municipality or province to such extent that large resources are required to deal with a disaster. And then we know that we get disasters that's very, very severe and extreme, and those are too big for the province or the municipality to deal with their own resources to fund that. Then there's, to support the municipalities and provinces, then there's a provincial disaster response grant, the immediate and a municipal disaster response grant. What that is meant, that is money that's contained in the 2024 Division of Revenue Act. As and when a disaster happens, it does not have to wait for adjustments budget. The money can, based on the verification done by the National Disaster Management Center, then they write a letter to the National Treasury. The National Treasury then also authorized the National Department of Cooperative Governance that they can release the funding to the provinces and municipalities concerned, and it amounts to 527.7 million over the 2024-25 financial year. There are still money available in this kitty, so it has not been fully depleted yet. But what is important, the verification process delays some of the release of the funding. Next slide, please. Then there's also another tool, and that is to reallocate existing infrastructure conditional grants. For this purpose, the only thing that is required is for the National Administrating Department and the National Disaster Management Center to agree to that, because what can happen is that projects that's contained on that list that was originally targeted to be funded through the grant, that infrastructure can also then be damaged, and then it's appropriate also to use that. And it can also mean that infrastructure that's not contained on the list to be dealt with through the conditional grant can then be put on the list to respond to those infrastructure that's damaged by the disaster. And then there's the contingency reserve, and it's contained in the UNU that Dr. Pakki's processed. And then there's also the 2025 MTF applications. Next slide, please. The MTF process, and that is also still under consideration. What is currently the case, the National Disaster Management Center has got a number of applications that they're currently verifying, and National Treasury is still working with the National Disaster Management Center to determine what is the appropriate funding over the 2025 MTF. And what often gets done, because rehabilitation takes a number of years, the funding can be structured over a number of years over the 2025 MTF, and more details of this will be released when we present the 2025 budget. So what Dr. Pakki's presented is a portion of the funding that's going to be considered, and that there's additional funding sources as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, honorable members, and thank you to the team from Treasury. It is now 10 o'clock, and I will then ask for members to be able to pose their respective questions as they go, and some comments to be made. If I can ask members that when you speak, if you can just indicate, just switch on your camera, and then you can put your hand up. So let me open the floor now for questions from honorable members. If you can indicate by the famous raise your hand button on the thing. Honorable Douglas, I recognize you. Honorable Kingsley, Honorable Burke, Honorable Neil May, I think, and then Honorable Galega, Mazibugu. Right. Let me start with you, Honorable Douglas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me start by thanking the presenters for the presentation. It's always very good to get detailed presentations. And I also want to thank them for giving it to us timeously this time, so that we can actually interrogate it. I think there's a number of things we raised yesterday that I'm not going to raise again. I think, with South Africa's GDP growth rate projected to hover around 1% over the MTF, largely due to limited diversification and an over-reliance on extractive industries. How does the government justify this no focus on industrial policy? Like, I cannot see any huge amounts of money being spent on creating manufacturing plants, chemical plants, creating infrastructure that will help us increase our GDP growth rate. When you look at public healthcare, funding remains insufficient given the healthcare challenges faced by the country. We just came through the medical legal issues, and despite knowing that there's processes involved in the medical legal issue and that it's legal processes, I think that this budget could have done more to address medical legal issues raised by the Appropriations and SCOA and SCOF and other committees over the last few weeks. And I don't see any of our inputs in the medical legal cases reflected in any of the legislation that was passed. And then I think that, our structural reforms has to be focused on sustainable economic growth rather than focusing on fiscal consolidation. We propose structural reforms such as public ownership of strategic sectors. And here again, we need to look at how we do things in South Africa and not simply do things for the sake of doing them and rubber stamping exercises. I think more and more, the longer I sit in appropriations, the more I understand is we're supposed to have oversight, but we end up being a rubber stamp. And I think we need to take up a much more activism approach, especially in a country where over 50% of our citizens live in poverty. And whilst this is true, there seems to be an attempt to reduce the value of social grants in real terms. And how does the government, through these policies, intend to address rising food and fuel costs affecting grant-dependent households without expanding social relief? Wouldn't an increase in grants as proposed by MK have a more stabilizing effect on this? I think I did a lot of questions yesterday, and I want to give other members an opportunity today to also speak. Thank you, sir.
Honorable Wakeland.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you very much. I just got a few matters I'd like to address. The first matter, which is close to my heart, is the matter of the municipalities not spending the disaster management funding. And possibly if we could get some indication which specific municipalities to assist. As well as there is an indication from the department that there's an expectation, let me rather say that way, that municipalities would budget for disaster management. My own experience is that very little municipalities actually do prepare for that. So if I could request, if we can have, and I'm not sure how the department actually interrogate to ensure that municipalities are prepared for disasters from their part, and what is the measurements they put in place. Then the matter of SARS, we heard the other day that the South African Revenue Service have got an absolute magic wand, if I may use that, as an approach to increase the income generation for our coffers. And they just in dire need for extra funding. And I would like to know if a proposal was made or submitted with regards from SARS to do some adjustment in their budget, particularly around the personnel cost. And if there was a request and if that was declined, and if we could relook at that, and if there's an interest to capacitate SARS more to fill the coffers. Lastly, Chair, the matter of the midterm development plan, the MDDP, not being available, what is the impact that will have going into the future when we start preparing for the new budget in 25 and 26? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Honorable Burke.
Thank you, Chair, and just thank you to Honorable Douglas for heeding our call from yesterday and creating a bit of space for other committee members. It's a genuine comment. Thank you for allowing the space so we can all ventilate issues. In general, thank you for the presentations given. The issue of this SANDF 2.2 billion rand has come up in a few spaces. I'm just trying to understand, the PMFMA is quite clear on section 16 when we can spend this amount of money. A question that we've raised in this community a few times over the last month or two is the fact that when it comes to defense spending, there's effectively two lines of authority. So where most SOEs and government departments have an ultimate accountability to the accounting officer. Here you have the Secretary of Defense, and the Auditor General is concerned about this, the Treasury is concerned about this, and now we're allocating another 2.2 billion rand for a mission in the Congo. So just want to get an understanding of what measures are in place this time to protect this 2.2 billion rand of not being squandered. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Honorable Neil May.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, everybody. Excuse my voice is a bit rough. I'm recovering from flu. Chairperson, thank you very much for the presentations. And I just have 4 points that I wanted to raise. And the one is, again, I agree with Honorable Wesley, the medical legal issue. I think that was the areas that I really thought that we would address in a way that would assist the Department of Health, because obviously those medical legal issues, and I understand listening, having had all the presentations from the Minister, from the SIU, but the challenge is the budget, you know, is health actually getting what they need? Because they're still having to pay those medical legal claims out of their budgets. I'm welcoming the grant, the increase of 350 to 370. Then in the second presentation, a very interesting aspect is the libraries. Now, I see that the provinces are going to be getting extra funds for their community libraries. Most of the libraries are in the municipalities, and the province is supposed to pay for those services because the libraries are being it's under a MOU with the province because it is the competency of the province. But those libraries fall under municipalities who are paying for all their services and then billing the province, and the province is not able to give enough subsidy towards those services. So it is an unfunded mandate on most of the municipalities' books in that instance. And I thought I must just highlight that. So in the community libraries, it's interesting. Would that be probably in the rural areas? I'm not sure, but they're not actually even funding fully the services that are being run by the municipalities. The disaster relief funds, very interesting when they're saying that they're not able to spend. I would like to see which municipalities are not able to spend, because I do understand that sometimes those funds do come in a little in the middle of the financial year, and it has taken a bit of time to fund some of the relief issues that have come up from disaster. But thank you very much. That's all that I have for today.
Thank you. Honorable Khaleda Mazibugu.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. Chair, my bandwidth is very weak.
It is unbelievably weak. But please proceed, Honorable Member. I will have to donate airtime to you.
Now. Okay.
Honorable Kalega, no, please, you can switch the video off, no? Honorable Kalega, Kalega Mazibu.
Can you hear me, Chair?
I can hear you. You can proceed. You don't have to keep the video on if it will make it easier for you, yeah?
Okay, thank you very much. Chair, I think it was the third presenter who spoke about the failures by the municipalities and even the provinces in spending the money allocated through the division of revenue. So my question would be, what is the accountability framework to ensure that appropriated funds are transferred to the provinces and municipalities from national departments, and also the accountability in terms of making sure that those funds are used accordingly? So if I could just get what is the accountability framework in place? And then also on the division of revenue, so how is DoRA then prioritizing maintenance? I think one of the questions I asked in the previous presentations, Chair, I think it was yesterday or when this was presented, was the concern I've raised in terms of the dilapidation of the infrastructure on our local municipalities. The roads are finished, I mean, the infrastructure in its totality, and the lack of maintenance plans in these municipalities. So my question is, how is DoRA prioritizing maintenance of infrastructure? And is the current allocation sufficient, considering the state of the infrastructure in general? And what is the projected increase of infrastructure maintenance in this medium term? So I don't want to take a lot of time, Chair. Those are the questions that I'm interested to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I have a number of questions, so given the allocated time, I'd like to just raise a few of them. The first one speaks to process, right? Yeah, Bo. Oh, sorry, Honourable Butler, I have not seen you earlier, so maybe you go, Honourable Butler.
Yeah, Chair, because I really don't want to speak. Okay, Chair, I just have 3 questions. Sorry for also not switching on my video. My first question is just, what are the risks of the community library services grant? Will it be incorporated into the provincial equitable share? And then what will happen if provinces don't prioritize the development of community libraries, and what measures are in place to ensure that there's development, Chair? And then the second question, Chair, is what is the extent of misuse of allocated grants for costs that are not assigned, aligned with the objective of the grant, and what measures does the NT implement to ensure such practices when it's not permitted? Chair, and just my last question, I'm not sure was this question asked already, but just noting an additional 3.1 billion that was allocated for the social relief of distress. What are the projected allocations in the medium term, and what are the considerations in relation to the introduction of a basic income grant? I thank you very much, Honourable Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Bartlett. As I'd begun, I wanted to raise a number of questions. See, the first, as I maybe started to indicate from yesterday, this is a collective conversation, is about the processing of all the respective documents, tabling of the budget speech, ultimately to the votes that Parliament take place. I hear what Honourable Douglas is saying as it pertains to this issue of rubber stamping. And I think to avoid, not only is it a perception, but the practice thereof, there are a couple of points that I flag. The first is that obviously we need to do a lot more about the Money Bills Act. And I feel like I'm singing the same tune as the previous chairperson of this committee, but it's something that we need to look at as a matter of urgency in the 7th administration, simply because when I look at it now, partly it feels like trying to take a sip out of a fire hydrant. But another way of looking at it is that it is deliberately so that we hurry the process along so that Parliament doesn't have the capability to be able to process it properly and be able to make significant inputs at the right time. And this is
there are many practicalities to this issue. For example, the Standing Committee on Finance is today holding its first public participation processes as it pertains to some of the laws that have been tabled, which means their report will be tabled, but all of this has to be adopted by Parliament by the 3rd of December. The Appropriations Committee is meeting on the 15th and the 29th. After that, we go to the 3rd, which is the vote. To me, I think that from a processing point of view, there's something anomalous about this issue, and we have to rectify it. Otherwise, we are paying lip service to both public participation and the notion that actually this reflects the people's budget. And to that effect, partly, I am a little bit concerned that the Minister of Finance is not at this meeting, simply because, again, if you look at what the processing of it, the Minister of Finance tabled the budget on Wednesday. The first interaction the committee had with the Minister of Finance, just the committee in general, was on the Thursday. And even at that particular meeting, it was limited to 2 hours because the Minister of Finance had to address an R&B function earlier on in the morning, arrived to the meeting at 12. That meeting had to finish at 2. And naturally, post facto, there is A, not enough time to get questions from the Minister of Finance, and B, you end up with the same process issue. I think, to me, these are, for me, in part, speak to the broader conversation about how we process the budget. And I think Parliament needs to reassert its own space in how it interacts with the executive as it speaks to the very respective legislation that is being put before us here. And so I want those points to be noted, and certainly we'll take them up further. To some of the questions that I want to raise. The first is, I'm not convinced, I ring the same bell. I'm not convinced that our debt management strategy in the long run is in fact consistent. When you look at other other bodies are projecting for us as a country an increase in debt, not a stabilization of debt. When the minister, the Director General, Mr. Peterson, responded to the question, he said, well, they've been saying that debt over the medium term will stabilize at about 75% or so. And over the medium term, much of that has been put to the table. I argue that I'm not convinced that that assumption necessarily will hold, given the suppressed GDP growth that we are looking at. And secondly, given the fact that many of our state-owned enterprises are coming to points where ultimately we have to make some fairly strong decisions about them. And in the absence of those decisions, there'll be a requirement for more bailouts. And thirdly, the fact that even looking at next year's budget, the deficit within that is increasing and increasing over the medium term, which wasn't projected for even in the February budget when we look at. So I'm not convinced that from a broader conversation about both deficits and debt, that we are quite clear that our strategy holds in this regard. Next year, we are projecting anyways a revenue less than expenditure, and therefore we'll continue to deal with the deficit question continuously relative to next year's budget. We had a massive assumption around SARS, and I know there's an appropriation been given to SARS to increase its own capacity base, but there were some crucial assumptions about revenue collection that have not been realized, and SARS under-collecting this year is one of the issues. One of the factors or variables that they gave towards the big under-collection conversation was fundamentally around the lack of imports of energy-related goods. Now, if the assumption was built on the continuation of load shedding and the import of that to me is a poor assumption going into the medium term. And I think that's something that we need to look at quite carefully, because I think if SARS projects one level of connection and under-collects on that basis, I do think that that is not a sustainable position to be in over the long term. We raised it yesterday, and I think it's a question worth for Treasury to respond to today, that our assumption that infrastructure expenditure or on growth initiatives can be dealt with in partnership with the private sector some of that needs to be tested, and I'd like to maybe get a feedback about where some of these projects, when I look at the big ones, whether it's on Operation Vulindlela or look at Transnet and the port management, I'm fascinated to learn where some of the earlier, where are some of the earlier realizations of that assumption? What is the basis on that? Because certainly when I looked at, when you have conversations with operators, if you look at even in some of our ports, there's a genuine frustration about PPPs as it speaks to Transnet, and perhaps maybe that is a question that is worth noting. Now, to the question about the special appropriations, I want to concur, and Honorable Burke had raised the question even with the Minister of Finance, and that's why in part I'd like to get my response. I am still unclear what we are doing in the DRC, let alone the accountability of the issue or any of that. I am baffled. Why? And it speaks to then this question about the special appropriations. It's not, I'm not here to pontificate on the politics of whether the ICJ case is legitimate or not legitimate. That's not my question. My question is, when I look at a chunk of what the special appropriations looks at, it looks at items that in some ways are not to the direct funding as it pertains to the South African citizen. So the ACJ case is but one example. The deployment of troops is but another example. That's not in the special appropriations. But when I look at, for example, the expansion of the presidency and cabinet, those are not necessarily matters that are of direct benefit to the citizen in the country. And so I'm anxious that when we look at the broader special appropriations bill, there are aspects of it that are not necessarily prioritizing the citizen. They are political in nature and certainly an expansion of cabinet, which I think for the sustainability of the budget over the medium term, I do think we need to think about rationalizing or rationalizing some of the departments. It is not a sustainable practice that we are heading into. And maybe to the last speaker, when we look at the provincial allocations, there is an adjustment in the provincial allocation in education that looks at the funding more exclusively for the Western Cape. I have no specific issue with the Western Cape. I might want to understand broadly whether, given the cuts that have occurred in other provinces where there's a consideration for additional funding that goes into those provinces, Gauteng's transport program being one, school feeding program being another. So I'd like to understand that. And then more to Treasury, specifically to you, because as we will be speaking to other departments, the same questions will come as we took Rendani, your perspective exclusive of the DA, worth noting that specific members are looking at specific budget vote or budget functions, as it were, and where all the respective departments fall within that. That will be an exercise we'll be putting forward in looking at particular sectors for the purposes of accountability as we comb through the budget. But perhaps maybe to Treasury, the funding that is, I think it's indicated in the rollover, does that speak to the famous IFMS program that Treasury were meant to look at, because it speaks about licensing and all of that? If that's not the same, then that's perfectly fine. I'm happy with that particular. You can just correct me on that issue. But other members will also be taking on respective departments or departments that fall within specific functions. This way we can be effective at accountability when we look at it. And that's not to suggest that parties are limited to speaking only on those particular functions. It's just that we want to be able to be effective as an appropriations committee when we look at how the budget is being put through, certainly in preparation for February next year. So those for me, in some ways, are some of the questions I hold going forward. And I think in principle, to support what Honorable Douglas is saying, the last place we want to be as a committee on appropriations, finance in general, is to, in 5 years' time, have to look at South African voters and say to them, we are effectively spending more on debt servicing costs and rather than on the people of this country, and for them to be able to look at us and say, well, what in the 5 years did you do about that? Because you allowed in certain instances, and I know the two things are not always relatable, but we watched some of the expenditures go up. We watched some of the cuts from frontline services, i.e. health, i.e. education, etc. We presided over those things as Parliament, and the people quite correctly, as they rejected some of the expenditure in the last 5 years by voting in the manner that they do, I would argue, I worry that if they start to opt out of democracy in the next 5 years as a declining voter population, we will have to explain to the people of this country how we presided over that period. And I think it would be an indictment on us as members of Parliament if we don't begin to think in an activist manner what are some of the things that we need to do to ensure not an enhancement of a social wage, but really on growth initiatives and the focus of that. Because I really, this is a crucial budget for me, and I reflect on it in that note, because citizens will ask us some real questions in the future. So let me park my questions there and allow for members of Treasury to respond. Honorable Sarokhen, are you indicating you want to start to respond?
Yes, I think that it is only appropriate that I start with the responses.
Perfect. Yes, please do.
Yeah, Chair, I think before we hand over to the technical team and the officials, I want to just answer a handful of things. The first is on industrial policy and industrialization. If you look on page 31 of the MTBPS, you'll see that the fastest growing line item in the budget is economic regulation and infrastructure. That grows at 10.9% a year over the next 3 years. But I do want to make the point that the industrial policy strategy of the state, including master plans and so on, isn't designed by or sits with Treasury. The presidency assigns functions to the department, and that function has been designed to the DTIC. And I do think that if the committee is wanting to hone in on industrial policy, the function of industrial policy sits with DTIC. So we'd be exceeding our mandate to discuss and try to unpack industrial policy and how the financing strategy sits there. But there is also the IDC, the Industrial Development Corporation, that does a lot of the funding on that as well. That's off the direct balance sheet of the Treasury, and that's also worth looking at for the details there. So just wanted to get into that. Then, Chairperson, more broadly, on social welfare, social spending, there were some comments around that, and some members welcomed the increase in the grants, others criticized it. 60% of the budget is spent on the social wage. That is free education, free healthcare, social care, active labor market programs, and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the point you made, Chairperson, is quite important, that 20% of the budget is then debt service costs. So between this, after the social wage and debt service costs, we've got 20% left for everything else. And that is something that vexes the Treasury. So it's quite important that we must understand that as well. And what we have hit after after a decade and a half of poor decisions is that we are now in this difficult situation where debt expenditure is becoming a big problem. And then that gets to some of the other points made around, Chair, the debt management strategy and the consistency and so on. You are also correct that there are various other models that show that if we don't deal with it in a meaningful way, debt will continue to rise. And that is why the achievement of the primary fiscal surplus is so important, and why we must anchor ourselves on the primary fiscal surplus over the next 3 years, because if we continue to allow debt service costs to rise beyond 20%, there's going to be very little left on the state's balance sheet for the kind of economic expenditure we need to create jobs. So it's very, very important that we start anchoring our debt and that we get it down to where it has been before the last decade and a half. Then, Chairperson, you asked also about revenue collection and the fact that revenue has underperformed due to the lower imports of solar panels and the fuel levy and so on. Also an important point. what the Treasury has done in the MTBPS chair is rolled forward. So they've modeled an assumption that load shedding would continue at a certain rate, and it hasn't. So for the next 3 years, that's the reduced taxes on that has been rolled forward. But I do want to make a point here that's quite important. When you look at the details on the tax numbers, that the tax numbers show that corporate income tax is up 11.5 billion rand, and that is year to date. And that is because of, and it is reflecting the MTBPS, because the efficiency gains from load shedding is beginning to give us some green shoots. And so corporate income taxes will continue to rise, hopefully. And we haven't rolled forward an over projection in corporate income tax, but we have rolled forward losses in the fuel levy and solar. So I think it's better to keep these things more conservative than to go excessively liberal on these things, and then you make bad allocated decisions. Then on the points around the DRC, the ICJ case, and the special appropriations, and the fact that some of this funding doesn't cater to South African citizens, Chair, again, this is your point stands. However, the decision to deploy troops sits with the presidency, and that is where I think that question needs to be answered. The Treasury has to make allocated decisions, but if the presidency issues something, then it's got to be funded, and that is just how government works with a strong executive presidency. And Chair, rationalizing the departments, you made that point as well, and I think others have touched on it. There's also a matter of government entities, and I think it's worth asking, and I'm sure some of the team at Treasury can speak about this as well, what the situation is, because every ministry and department has a whole host of entities, each having their own corporate services, their own HR functions, and so on. And there's a lot of scope for rationalization in the states and cost savings on the rationalization of entities in multiple departments. Then, yep. So, Chair, I just wanted to cover the top lines there on the more politically charged questions, that the official can answer the questions more technically. I think that there was various questions around local government as well as public finance. So I think maybe let's start with Rendani and then Okhale and then the team from there. So Rendani, maybe I can hand back to you.
Thanks, GM. You have dealt with most of the questions, but let me deal specifically with the one by Honorable Beck on how are we going to make sure that money is not squandered, etc. We're talking about the allocation to the SNDF. One of the conditions that we've put, or that goes with this allocation, one, it has been earmarked. We are going to monitor it on a monthly basis. And most importantly, we have requested that we do a comprehensive spending reviews on the departmental budget, that's a defense budget. So that's, and again, coupled with that, there is a cabinet decision for defense together with DPE, National Treasury, and other relevant stakeholders to come up with a defense strategy. So the conditions, this allocation goes with those conditions. So we're still going to engage further on all of these issues. And then there were questions around social grant and health. I will invite Mark to give some more inputs on this one. And then there was also a question by the chair, I think, on treasury rollover. I will invite Gillian to talk more about it. Allow me, Chair, to hand over to my colleague, Mark, who can talk on health and social development issues. Over to you, Mark, and thereafter is going to be Gillian. Thanks. Gillian, Mark?
Thank you, Chair. Maybe I can start. Sorry, my camera seems to be misfunctioning. I want to address two questions that was raised. Honorable Chair, the one was raised by Honorable Wakeland with regard to allocation to SARS. As you have mentioned, Chairperson, There was additional allocations made to SARS to address the capacity constraints and also system modernization in SARS. There was a 2 billion allocation for this year and also for the next year. We're also looking at adjusting the baseline of SARS then in the next MTEF. So we're really looking at capacitating SARS to improve the revenue collection. With regard to the rollover of the presidency, that was approved based on a commitment that the presidency had with CETA for the training on the e-cabinet. There was just a delay in the payment, but the commitment was concluded in the previous financial year, and on that basis, the rollover was approved for the presidency. Thank you, Chair.
Chair, let me come back. I see that my colleague is not here. I apologize for that. Let me come back to the health issues raised. And my colleague from the IGR will also add a special on medical legal claims. There was a question around investment in health. Let me indicate that we have got conversations between our ministers in relation to the investment in health. Especially that with or without NHI, there are certain things that needs to be done. Most importantly, investment in health infrastructure. So the discussions are still going on in relation, especially funding for HR, that's human resource, and most importantly, alternative ways of funding for the health infrastructure. The most important one being the investment in primary health care, etc. And again, on the social development side, just to also indicate that there's also a project, I think in the MTBPS publication, I think page 35, there is a box on active labor market programs. Included in there, it's the social protection. So we hope to conclude the project by end of March, and thereafter it will follow the cabinet process. In short, it is meant to deal with the fragmentation, etc., of public employment initiatives, including exploring other alternatives, given that, for example, SRD, 60% of SRD recipients are young people that's below 35. And some of them, they've got qualifications, etc. Exploring ways of transitioning them to something meaningful. So I will hand over now to my colleagues in IGR to expand on some of these issues. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. So I will respond to some, and then I'll ask my colleagues to get ready on the disasters. If Wendy, Litsepa, and Sello can respond. Sello, on the side of spending, if you could assist with that. And Julia would also assist us on the libraries. On the medical legal, yes, I think members, I think we do accept that obviously funding is not adequate. But that's to say, because the Honorable Douglas raised the issue that medical legal is not addressed in the bills that have been presented to Parliament. There are a number of ways that the medical legal needs to be addressed. So firstly, there are issues of the contingent liability that provinces are continuing to clean up. So there was a time the contingent liability of medical legal was above 100 billion. Now we're at 60 billion because they're cleaning that. So there's also an issue of record keeping. Record keeping is important because as they go to court, they need to prove that there was no negligence on the part of the state. But with that, in that regard, National Department of Health, working with the departments, provincial departments, and CSIR, they're busy with digitizing the sector with regards to the records. And also the issue of obviously quality of care is important, that we do have inadequate personnel that could be able to provide the quality of care so that we don't have such a lot of these cases. But also the issue of the State Liability Amendment Bill needs to be also amended so that maybe we then don't pay lump sums, but we look at periodic payments so that the provincial departments are able to afford it. But I must say, members, that if you look at previously what provinces used to spending above 2 billion rands a year on medical legal, so at the end of September, which is halfway through the financial year, they've spent just around 700 million. But obviously, some of those cases came from your last year, not necessarily the case that started this year. So you know that court cases generally take long to conclude. But it's the space that we are watching as National Treasury. And obviously, once there's funding, additional funding that could be provided, it's one of the areas that we recommend that it goes to that area. I think maybe coming to the issue of Honorable Maimani, the last question on education, funding for education, particularly for Western Cape, just to indicate that particularly for this budget for facility for infrastructure, budget facility for infrastructure, that so this funding for Western Cape was approved during for the 2024 MTF. It was not done now. And just to indicate that prior to they got theirs in the 2023, if I remember correctly, or 2022 MTF, Gauteng also got the similar funding for schools. As you know that these two provinces struggle with the issues of migration, so they need to deal with ensure that the adequate classes, number of classes for the learners. But just to say that, honorable members, that even for other provinces, there were submissions, but we have realized that there's a problem with capacity or capability in other provinces with regards to whether they submit to BFI for infrastructure. But as National Treasury, we have redirected them to where we have provided funding for preparation and packaging of projects, so that as they come and then we're able to ensure that they also benefit from BFI. Certainly, we're looking into that area. So, if I could ask the colleagues to also, I think the issue of how DoRAB prioritizes maintenance, if we could look at that. Let's say, and then I'll ask Sello and Wendy to add. Thank you.
Thanks, Tirichi, and thanks to the honorable members for their questions and insights on these things. I think I'm going to have a first step in terms of how maintenance is provided for in terms of the division of revenue, and then also maybe touch on some of the disaster-related question, maybe noting to the honorable members that we would be also happy to provide the list that the members have requested, and also maybe the challenges that have been identified in each of those municipalities. I think it would also be proper to then also perhaps get NDMC to also provide us with the kind of support that they are doing in supporting those municipalities. So honorable members, about 10.6 billion through the division of revenue, through the local government equitable share, is actually put aside for maintenance of infrastructure that services the poor. And it's quite important, honorable members, that we make that distinction, because the municipalities are then also charged with ensuring that they set cost-reflective tariffs, which would also then look at the whole value chain in terms of delivering the service. Municipalities are in a very fortunate position because the services that they offer to the communities actually lend themselves at cost recovery. So maintenance should actually be part of that package of the cost reflective tariffs. And I know my colleagues within the local government budget analysis unit within the Treasury are dealing with those issues and helping municipalities in terms of those cost reflective tariffs. So this is just a portion that is set aside for this type of municipalities, but generally we want municipalities to be able to recover the money that they spend on maintenance through those avenues that are available to them. But also, in addition to that, the honorable members would have heard about the reform in terms of the trading services, where the Treasury is leading a multi-sectoral approach to how we then, take care of the goods that lays the golden egg, as the metros are for us, an engine of growth. How then do we get to support them? So the various initiatives that are part of that package, which then assist or are meant to assist the municipalities deal, with the issues of infrastructure, but meets also the operations and maintenance are part of it. So there is an incentive component that is being introduced through the grant reform to then assist in that regard. So we do expect that there's going to be actually quite an elevated effort in terms of increasing the spending on maintenance of infrastructure through the various incentives that we have in the system. We also have incentives also in the road space. So municipalities are being funded for road maintenance, especially in areas where they can use the data that is generated through a grant that the Department of Transport is managing. This is also to ensure that the processes are streamlined, and then that municipalities are actually investing in the right kind of areas as far as maintenance is concerned. One of the honorable members indicated the issue around the plans, maintenance plans that are not in place, and the grant system as well over the last 3 years has tried to respond to that challenge by allowing the municipalities that want to invest in terms of asset management plans to then be able to do that. And this also transcends to the issues that we're picking up in terms of the preparedness or lack thereof in terms of the disasters. The minister mentioned in his speech that local government experiences in terms of accessing and dispersing the emergency funding when a disaster has occurred is undergoing detailed analysis. And what is quite critical is that we have here identified 40 municipalities that over the past 3 years, since 2022, have really experienced the severe challenges of climate change, which culminated in many forms, be it the droughts that we've seen in Gqeberha in the Western Cape, but also the floods that have really hit KZN and Eastern Cape in the main quite hard. So those 40 municipalities are going to give us a really good sense of the kind of preparedness measures that we want to put in place to assist the municipalities, but also some of the reforms that we want to introduce into the local government space. All this is linked to the disaster risk financing strategy that the Treasury is leading, where we want to increase the effectiveness of the finance mobilization measures, but we're also looking at really how then do we start to improve the disbursements of funds. Here we're streamlining the grant mechanisms that are available and how we can then also root out inefficiencies and leakages and also the bottlenecks in the system. All this we're doing through the review of the conditional grant system, where we will be able to talk more about this in the main budget as most of the reforms will then be introduced in terms of the system. I think, Chair, maybe I should end there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I just want to check if there are any additional questions from members that they would like to put forward, given that I see you want to raise a particular point. Let me hand back to you while other members prepare questions if they've got.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning to everybody and specifically honorable members. I am still from the National Treasury also. I'm going to address or try to respond to few questions that relate to the local government space. The first one, Chair, it's an issue around the disaster funding. Indeed, I think the question that disasters are being unspent or the performance is not very satisfactory. It is true, but I think the overlaying response, and of course there could be other answers to that, is that we have transferred as national government disaster funding late to municipalities in the financial year, and there are reasons for that. In terms of the 2023 financial year, which is what I'm going to respond to, the members would notice that we've got two types of disaster grants. The first one is the emergency response, where should a disaster strike, we need to respond immediately. This would be to provide shelters, water, urgently to the affected communities. But then we've got the second type of a disaster, which is the recovery. There we allocate funding for the actual reconstruction of that which has been damaged. So when we allocate funding, we always separate the two. What is important is that we always don't know where the disaster will strike. So therefore, the allocations in the division of revenue bill would in the main be unallocated. And as and when a disaster strikes, then we release the money, then allocate per municipality. What happened in the previous financial year, 23-24, is that initially the DoRAB had allocated, the Division of Revenue Act had allocated about 320 million for the recovery aspect and about 700 million plus for the immediate response. Obviously, that was inadequate. And during last year's MTBPS, then the Treasury through the minister then added to that pot an additional 1.3 billion. Just like our deputy minister indicated, as soon as we are done with the process of debating, we need to then get the division of revenue bill to be assented, to be an act, then subsequently then the Treasury must gazette this. In terms of the process, what happened last year, we only managed to gazette the division of revenue bill in February. And this is just the process because we need to allocate for debate and so on. And ultimately, municipalities only got the additional 1.2 billion of the recovery only in Feb and March. So that in itself said, given that municipalities' year ends in June, municipalities had that time 4 or 5 or so months to actually deliver on a mandate. However, within our process, we've got the rollover process, which we facilitate. We have since received multitude of rollover requests because indeed municipalities could not spend given the time. And as it stands, about 1.4 billion was requested by these municipalities in the form of a rollover, and we are supporting them almost all of it. For obvious reasons, we would like them to continue. They could not spend because not all municipalities are applying emergency procurement process in order to fast track on the process. So therefore, we are supporting them with a rollover. So they will continue. And I think it is fair that we should allow them, given that the funding only got to them late. There could be other reasons, but I think to be fair to municipalities, we all did not know when the disaster will strike and where, and therefore we gave them the money at that time. There was a question by Honorable Neil May on the list of municipalities that are underspending on the disaster. Indeed, Honorable Member, it would be all municipalities that we would have given them the allocations, and we've got the list. It's even in the Gazette, because most of them did not spend the money, but we have a list per province, and generally it's the Eastern Cape, the KZN, the Limpopo, and Mpumalanga, and these are provinces that were hard hit last year, and we've supported all of them, and therefore they could not spend. But we have the details. We will be able to share. Maybe I can touch a little bit on the library story. Indeed, we agree that the library remains what is called an unfunded mandate. Treasury, together with provincial treasuries, we have been engaging with them to say we need to find a way to assist our municipalities to be in a better position to plan for the spending around the library function. The DoRAB provides that if a province intends to, through MOU, to allocate money to municipalities for the delivery of service, they need to first gazette. In the early past, our provinces were not able to do that, but as it stands, we are now able to publish, even from the Treasury's point of view, all the gazettes that provinces are saying they plan to give municipalities. So what is now an issue is for us, together with provinces, to start to monitor these monies. Municipalities have been saying that monies only get transferred to them late in the financial year, and they always don't know what are they for. So we've dealt with that issue. All provinces that are having library function in terms of the budget are now able to gazette those, and we're able to now identify how much and to share with municipalities at the budget tabling process, that they're able to know what's coming their way and for their planning processes. It is early stages. Obviously, there are teething problems, and they may not always know what specifically what they're supposed to do, but it is something that we're working jointly with our province. Maybe I should stop there, Chair. I think, I think these are the questions that I wanted to respond to. Thank you.
Okay, maybe just to add on the libraries, Chair, that the funds is for operations and salaries of the people working in libraries, and just to indicate that so generally the libraries in rural areas are under provinces, mostly those that are, I would say, underfunded, either in the big cities that are under municipalities. But as the law said, we continuously working with provinces to address that issue. So I think the other issue that how will we ensure that provinces prioritize libraries? So we do have processes of monitoring the spending, provincial spending. We meet with them throughout the year, whether to look at how the spending is going across departments, or also normally December, January, we meet with them to assess their budgets and look at how they're funding priorities. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you very much. Honorable Douglas, you had a follow-up question.
Mr. Chair, I'm just starting with my camera quickly. Just give me a second, if you don't mind. I would just want to actually follow up on that discussion that you had about not being a rubber stamp. I think that if we can work out a mechanism, as you said, it allows us to focus on the committee's work in a sense of how do we prevent what happened last week with the MTBS, PBS from happening again, in the sense that every single time the documents seem to arrive late or the site of it, when we get presentations, we like either 10 or 20 MPs and must ask 2 minutes sessions. I don't think the democracy is best served in us being given short times to go through volumes of documents. To me, that's not oversight, that's trying to hide from oversight. So the one thing I wanted to check on was the SOE debt and sustainable reform issues. With Eskom holding over 84% of guaranteed SOE debt, how do we going to make sure that in future we are reforming SOEs for private benefit rather than trying to privatize them? And this is part of the challenge, because we must consider that we must nationalize strategic industries to be a more effective way than what we're currently doing, and to chop it up further and sell it to the highest bidder. It's been seen not to be the best way to do things. So I would prefer if we could have a discussion about that also, and not just have discussions on the status quo. But for now, I think that will be where I'll leave it. The process of how we do our work is not working. It's really not working. I really feel like a rubber stamp. I really feel that we can just debate after the fact. But as for actually performing oversight, I don't think we're able to do that in the current system, the way it's structured. Thank you.
Dr. Burke.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Ms. Karakwe. I hope I haven't mispronounced that. The first part of the question is fairly simple. On the infrastructure grant, how many of the other provinces applied unsuccessfully? You mentioned that both Gauteng and the Western Cape were successful. And the second question I have is, it seems that the 253 million rand that was paid is a part of a larger tranche, as far as I can see, 2.549 billion rand for the Western Cape, which was already announced provisionally in February. And you mentioned Gauteng was similar. Could you just confirm that the total amount approved was also in the vicinity of 2.5 billion rand for Gauteng, if not bigger? And then finally, just related to all of that, I'm assuming that this tranche of 253 that was now paid out has to do with the fact that some conditions were met. If you could just clarify that first. Thank you.
Thank you. Rendani or the Deputy Minister?
Chair, I think we'll hand to, I think in this case, it's Okhale that needs to answer the questions on the provincial and local government matters. Chair, just on the point from Honourable Douglas on SOE debt, I think that someone from the team, Rendani, I think maybe from your side, can help with the public finance side. Just on the question on the processing of the budget, Chair, that's largely an issue with Parliament and how Parliament's processes are. So obviously from the executive side, it would be inappropriate. That's a matter for the legislature to deal with. So I don't want to cross my boundary in terms of separation of powers. Thanks.
At the risk of trying to disrupt, I had a brief discussion on two accounts. The first is with the Chief Whip, and the second is obviously with the Money Bills Act and the amendment thereof, speaking to how we process much of the legislation that comes forward, and more crucially, in being able to look at, I merely raised the time about timelines because that will require how we engage with the executive. Certainly my comments on even just the Minister of Finance's availability, etc., how we take that going forward, especially towards the main budget framework, because otherwise we're going to face the same difficulties. It was the same in the 6th administration. If you look at the legacy report, I think that we do need to urgently have an engagement on that. So I will certainly meet with the Chair of Finance. We've set up a meeting with the Chair of Chairs, and we'll look at how this timetabling issue begins to be resolved, not only legislatively, but in some practical terms, because in all reality, the last place we need to be is in a space where we just literally are just trying to rubber stamp processes. But let me allow the rest of Treasury to respond in this regard.
Hey, thank you, Honorable Beck. It's Harekwe, the surname. Thank you. So in terms of the funding, yes, you're correct. The 251, I think, is because they met some conditions. That's the reason why I did not get it right at the beginning, because I needed to meet some conditions. Gauteng have received 1.5 billion previously for the similar. So Eastern Cape has previously applied, but the way they packaged the projects were not convincing. As well as Free State, I think they applied as well this year. But as I indicated, we are finding help for them so that they can package their projects appropriately, so that they can also be approved for funding. Thank you.
Chair Randani here. On ESCOM, I think our colleagues from ALM are the ones who can speak with authority. Unfortunately, they are not here. Some of the colleagues, they are following the discussions on the fiscal framework, and we know that we are due to respond on Friday. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. No, I appreciate the response from Treasury. Thank you very much for those. Honorable members, with that in mind, I'm now going to, we've taken all the inputs and the deliberations that we can. Our next committee meeting will be taking place on Tuesday next week. Please do keep in mind that next week, Friday, the 15th, is an extended schedule on public hearings. And therefore, if I can request that members set aside most of that day, simply because we've not only got a number of submissions coming forward, but we are also trying to make sure we give appropriate time towards that. Mashile, I don't know if there are any other announcements from our end.
Yes. Thank you so much, Chair, and morning again, honorable members and guests. With respect to, in regards to the next week meeting, I scribbled a note this morning. Let's say it's tentative because a directive has been given from the Office of the House Chair that the meetings for Tuesday the 12th will be cancelled, because I think there's a 3-line whip for the entire day. And then we tentatively thought that we would shift our meeting for Tuesday to Wednesday to take both the PBO as well as the FFC. But in that regard, we will make a formal announcement before the end of the week as to what we will do with that meeting. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Yes. With those announcements having been dealt with, I don't think there are any other deliberations going forward. It is now 11:05. I move to close the meeting. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, colleagues. Cheers.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. You have a good day, colleagues.
Thank you very much. I'll see you next week.